Yes, the Sega Saturn, Sega's very first dedicated 3D console that wasn't the 32X or the Sega CD. I had it back in the day, and I have some great memories and some not so great memories and some good stories, so stay tuned. I saved up my money for it, and I was like, I am not getting ripped off again, because you know my story about the 3DO and my cousin getting totally scammed on the CDI. So enough with these other companies trying to come up with video game systems and take a piece of the marketplace. I was like, Nintendo and Sega are here for good. They're not going away. They're not going anywhere. So I'm just sticking with them. Now, Nintendo was still riding high in the hog with the Super Nintendo. I'm amazed that system went for as long as it did, but for good reason. But Sega was always trying to do the cutting edge thing. They were always trying to stay on top of the game. What's new in technology? We got to do something to beat the competitors, mainly Nintendo. And so they decided finally to come out with a dedicated console that wasn't actually somehow attached to the Sega Genesis. And they came out with the Sega Saturn. Now, what's interesting is, the system looks good. I think it still looks good even today. It's simplistic, it's black, it's stealthy, and it's just a simple square and says Sega Saturn on the top. It's a top loader, 2 control ports, controller's great. But one thing that was interesting is that the Japanese version is actually a different color. It's like a light gray, which is interesting because most Sega products, they were black no matter where you got them. Like the Mega Drive and the Genesis, they're both black. This Sega CD is the same color, 32X. They didn't really change the colors much on their systems, except for this one. So that was interesting. And the controllers were slightly different. Now, I'm not taking away anything from the US, or if you want to call it the Western, let's just call it the black controller. It's good. It feels, though, a little bulky, like it's like a potato in your hand a little bit, but it's still got the 6 buttons in a row and proper D-pad, L and R buttons on top. Can't go wrong there. But I also later on bought the Japanese version of the Sega Saturn just for collector's purposes. And I actually like the controller on that one better. It feels more like a slightly upgraded version of the Sega Genesis 6-button controller. And I don't know, I just think it feels better. And it's actually one of the best retro gaming controllers that I've actually held and felt and played with. So it's almost flawless. It just doesn't have any analogs on it or anything like that, but it's fantastic. Now, another thing that Sega had going for it too was they had the arcades. They had the very first 3D polygon-based arcade games that I ever saw, namely Virtua Fighter and then Daytona later on. So I was like really intrigued by it. I looked at it. It didn't blow my mind, but I was like, there was something different about it. And I was like, oh, this is like this virtual reality thing that they're doing now, right? Only you didn't have to put, the stupid goggles on or anything. And I was like, I get it. And it's called Virtua Fighter and whatever, right? And so I sort of understood what they were trying to do with it. I plugged some quarters into it. I played it. I liked it. I was intrigued by it, right? But and that was a selling point of the Sega Saturn because I knew that I was going to get those games right away. And I don't know where it was with you, but when I bought my Sega Saturn, it came with Virtua Fighter packed in. So I knew I was getting that game straight up. Now, I had played the game, or not played it, but I seen it. They had demonstrations of it in these video game stores that were popping up all over the place. You didn't have to go mainstream like Zellers or Wolco or whatever if you had them at the time, or Target. I don't know where you live, but that's what we had. And you didn't. There was a gaming chain that came up that was called Master Player, and it was a whole bunch of gaming stores, and it was great. They sold used games all over the place. You could get them for a quarter of a price of what it would cost you for a new game. I loved those stores when they came out. So, long story short on that one is that they had demonstrations of new games that were out, but they said demos on them and you couldn't play them. You could play other games, but not like the newest ones. They were uncompleted, and they said that on them. They said this is just a demo game. It's an unfinished game, but it gives you a sneak peek of what it looked like. And I was like, oh, okay, cool. So it's not finished. But when I plugged in Virtua Fighter on Sega Saturn for the very first time and played it, I was like, oh, it looks exactly the same as the demo one. So the polygons were very jaggy. They had that saw blade effect on them. They weren't as smooth as the arcade at all. And also, they didn't have fingers. The polygon count on the Sega Saturn was too low, I thought. And this is when we're moving into 3D. territory, this is what people were talking about the most in the video game magazines and everything. It was all about polygon count. Can this system do more polygons than another one? How many does it push before the system's bogged down? Or how much can it max out at? And so it was too low. So it always looked like the fighters had mitts instead of fingers like in the original one. And I didn't like that because I wanted it to look a lot more closer to what the arcade could produce. And then later on they came up with Virtua Fighter Remix and they just put textures on the polygons, but they just faked the fingers. They were still mittens. They just put some lines on them to make it look like they had fingers. So I'm not going to talk too much about Daytona because I think it's one of the worst games on the system. The pop-ups are horrendous, okay? The arcade was much better. It was much more futuristic because it was a polygon racing game. The first one I think I probably ever played. And I think you actually sat down in a car and had a steering wheel and everything. So playing it at home was okay. You didn't have to put quarters into it anymore. I didn't pay full price for it. I bought it used at Master Player, got a good price on it. But man, it got old really fast. Terrible pop-ups, and I think it's a prime example of the worst probably pop-up game there is. If you know another one, type it in the comments down below. But yeah, Daytona's really, really bad. So there's that one. There's many other games though on the Sega Saturn that were very, very, very good. Like you could talk about the Street Fighter games that were on it. They're excellent. I owned a few of them, not all of them, but they were pretty much carbon copy perfection at this time. And the very first time that I even played these 2D type arcade games that were identical to the arcade. They were great on Super Nintendo, they were good on Genesis, they were pretty good on 3DO, but they were absolutely flawless on the Sega Saturn. And one thing that I want to mention about the system, and this is my own little thing on it, is it had a slot on the back of it that you could plug other things into it. You could plug like extra RAM into it, or I think like a memory card, or they had those cheating almost like Game Genie things you could plug in. But what we thought at the time was, when we saw that, was it was a rumor that you could actually plug Sega Genesis games into it. Yes, that it was backwards compatible with Sega Genesis. Imagine how good the system would have been if they did that. That is a major lost opportunity from Sega, that they did not do that. If it was backwards compatible with Sega Genesis, man, dude, that would have been just absolutely balling right out of the park. A game that I did not have because I didn't own the system for very long, because we know what system came out next and, you know, basically dominated it and took over the industry by storm. Save that for another video. Was Guardian Heroes. I didn't own it. I didn't even play it, so I can't say much about it. People rave about it all the time, and I mean, it looks pretty good. It is a Sega Saturn exclusive, but I did have Panzer Dragoon. I played that. I did like it. Again, the graphics were a little jaggy on it. They're a little pixelated, but it was still a great game. Another 3D arcade game that I had to get at the time was Virtua Cop, again, so I didn't have to put quarters into it, because remember, people were still at the time of when we still went to arcades and plugged in quarters into games, because they were still the place that you needed to go to see the next level stuff when it came to graphics, right? So it came with the zapper gun, it came with the light gun, which was a hell of a lot better than the actual Nintendo one. So I played Virtua Cop for a bit. It got a little old pretty quickly, got a little stale pretty quickly, but it was fun at the time when I first had it. Played the hell out of it. I played Sega Rally, bought that one as well. And then the actual final game that I got for the system before I got rid of it was, of course, the best of the best, the cream of the crop, Virtua Fighter 2. When I first saw this game in the arcade, blew my mind. 60 frames a second, they did everything right. My God, if they could have got that amount of power, that amount of technology into the Sega Saturn, which they kind of did later on with the Dreamcast. But if they did that with the Saturn, if they just got it closer, oh my Lord, it would have been so rad. I loved it. It played like the arcade. It didn't look exactly like the arcade, but you still got it, you know what I mean? You still got that 3D effect, and you still got the characters and everything like that as well. But man, the arcade, the intro still gives me goosebumps. It totally sucks you in. So if you actually have a Virtua Fighter 2 arcade, forget the Sega Saturn. If you actually have the arcade cab, man, you've got one of the best before arcades went the way of the dodo bird, you've got one right there, man. Oh man, I want that. I'm gonna be looking for that. Or come out with an arcade. Why don't they, man, Sega, come out with these arcade 1-up things. Come out with a Virtua Fighter 2 one. I will buy it just like that. So that's it. Those are my stories and my games and my top picks about the Sega Saturn. It was great, but it was basically a flash in the pan. It wasn't out for very long before it was basically dismissed almost immediately by the PlayStation coming out after it. And then they gave up on it, and then they started in development at the time for, of course, the Sega Dreamcast. Save that again later for another video, maybe not, I don't know. I'm reaching the end now, but if you guys did watch the video all the way to the end here, thank you very much for that. Hit the thumbs up button for Sega Saturn and all of its awesomeness that it did have, which it did. It didn't suck, okay? It was still good. And if you want to see me talk about another retro system, click over there. And if you want to subscribe, I really appreciate it. Hit that bubble over there, or else, donkeys will come into your yard and eat your dog.